This lecture is going to address Hellenistic sculpture and the Greek theater at Epidaurus. We'll address the sculptures first and then end with the theater. And he would establish some canons of proportions. You can see on the lower right. You don't have to, worry about the details of this, but he would establish, how big the head should be in relationship to the torso, in relationship to the thighs, in relationship to the shins, etc. And it was thought to be the most, perfect representation of the male form. On the upper right, we see a reconstruction of it where he has the walking stick. And in the center, we can see the backside of the Doryphorus with the buttocks shifting and portraying this walking posture. The strut there holds the statue up. And it's a statue in the round. It's one that we can walk around and observe and admire the male human form there. Okay, we've seen this a lot before. We've talked about male nudes a lot. We haven't seen any female nudes, but we will begin to see them when we get into the 4th century and into the Hellenistic period. And let's start with Praxiteles and two interesting statues he has here. I mentioned the female nudes. We see one on the right. I'll come to her in a moment, but I'd first like to talk about the statue in the center and the detail on the left of Hermes and Dionysus. Now, here's the story. Dionysus, he's the god of wine and revelry. We've talked about him before. When he was born, in another version of the myth of Dionysus, Hermes takes care of him. Now, what we know is happening here, because we have descriptions of this from ancient sources, is that Hermes in his right hand is holding up a bunch of grapes. And Dionysus, the baby here, is reaching out with his missing left hand to grab one. And so it's a cute little scene where Hermes is sort of teasing the baby Dionysus. Of course, Dionysus wants grapes, being the god of wine. And it's a playful little moment here. Notice, however, once again, the faces are not showing any emotion yet. There is an S curve to the shape of the body that Praxiteles would introduce and just give it more dynamism, giving the statue more dynamism. The strut holds up the statue, and conveniently, Hermes' left arm leans on it and holds the baby Dionysus, whose right arm comes onto the shoulder of the sculpture, and also keeps the sculpture intact, distributes the weight quite evenly. We also see Praxiteles attempts to cover the strut, unlike the Doryphorus before, and put a cloth over top of it, so it isn't so obvious that it's being held up by a strut. So this is one of his very famous sculptures. Interestingly enough, I was just talking to a colleague at the meetings I attend in early January, and he specializes on this period. And the reason it's so shiny, I didn't know this recently, is that in the Roman period, this statue was actually taken and polished or repolished to make it so shiny, which is just sort of interesting. But we can see but it also reflects the degree to which the Romans admired Greek art. And I'll talk about that more later on. Now here we see on the right, and this is quite important, our first female nude. It's the Aphrodite of Cnidos. Aphrodite is the goddess of love, of sexual love, of carnal love, and she is portrayed here in the nude, either taking off or putting on her clothes that drape over a hydria. A hydria is a vessel that holds water, and this operates as the strut as well. Before I talk about her body, I would like to point out also the emotionlessness of her face. And if you can compare the Hermes on the left and the Aphrodite on the right, they're not that far apart facially speaking. Hers is a bit less squarish and more feminine in that way. But she also has the S curve that Hermes has in this contrapposto stance. Um, but we see her for the first time as a nude. And it's in the 4th century that nudes would become quite popular, nude females, that is, quite popular in the stance. Um, Now, her gestures with her arms, or at least with her right arm, is interesting. It's called a pudica posture, which I'll bring to talk about in a moment. But the question is she being modest by covering herself or not? She certainly isn't covering her breasts, and she's not making too much of an attempt to cover herself. And in many ways, it might be a coyish, coquettish posture, in the sense that her hand might cover her genitalia, but at the same time draws one's eyes to it. Um, and after all, she was the goddess of sexual love, so she, the idea of her being desirous in this way, though foreign to the Christian mind, would not have been back then. So, in many ways, she might not be being modest in this statue, but quite the opposite. Uh, you don't have to know this statue itself, but here you see the pudica posture with this woman with her left arm covering her groin area, and with her right arm beginning to cover her breasts and crouching a little bit. Now, the pudica, that name was given to it in antiquity, this posture, because it has a double meaning. If it comes from the Greek, from the pudenda, which means, that's a woman's, pubic area. But it also can come from the Latin pudor, which means shame or modesty. So, and this would have been understood by the ancients of it. It has a very sexually explicit name, but it can also mean a woman who is trying to cover herself up. So this would be a very common posture for female nudes in the Hellenistic period. And here we see a variation of that. A little bit later in the Hellenistic period, we see here the statue of Aphrodite and Pan. The nickname of it is the slipper slapper, because she's holding up her slipper with her right hand and trying to keep Pan off her. So here's the sort of the joke of this statue. The Pan is a half goat, half man, and he runs through the woods and attempts to avail himself, let's say, to a women. Aphrodite's not receptive. The hairy legs and the horns were symbols of male virility or of male desire in the ancient world. The idea of, quite frankly, to be brutally frank, the word horny actually comes from the idea that goes back to antiquity of a man in this such desire would be like this, animal with horns. Now he grabs at her. Now, and she pulls away a little bit with her left arm and is about to slap him with her slipper. But at the same time, her assistant, Eros, or Cupid, comes off her left shoulder and touches him. Now remember, Cupid is the one that inspires love with his arrows or with his touch. And is the assistant of Aphrodite, Aphrodite, the goddess of sexuality. And so there's a double meaning here, or a contrasting meaning, a conflict, where she is at once inspiring him to be so desirous, but at the same time pushing him away. But again, notice with her the weight taken off her left leg, once the slipper came, and she stands in this contrapposto with the weight on her right leg. She has these feminine hips that come higher and up above the navel, a bit higher than you would see on a man's hips. And then notice with the Pan how muscular it has become. And we'll see that there's this transition from the swimmer's body to more like a weightlifter's body. And one interesting thing too is there's a triangular effect on this statue as far as the weight goes, where she pulls away from the left, he sort of attacks from the right, but then they're connected by the cupid. And not only does this send the meaning in a circle, her rejection, his desires, and Cupid uniting these, but it also gives the weight and structure of the sculpture itself great support. And speaking of muscles, this is the very famous bronze boxer at rest, sometimes called the pugilist. This is a wonderful bronze statue. I wish we could talk about this in class because it's always a good statue for discussion. Because there's a question of, what's he when he's looking up, what emotion is he giving off? Look at his face on the left with the open, gaping mouth. Once again, his eyes would have semi-precious stones in them. His lips are made with a higher copper content of the bronze in order to make them red. And then with this very naturalistic hair and beard on the man. But you look at him and you want to sympathize with him. It's as if he's just suffered a brutal beating and is sitting down and has just had enough. It's just I can't go through this anymore. And this brings us to one of the concepts that we see in Hellenistic sculpture. One is pathos, Pathos, and pathos is we see the suffering of people and we empathize with their suffering, as we do in this case. But there's also a bit of pruriency. Pruriency, Pruriency. Pruriency is the idea of sort of looking through the keyhole at somebody's private life. Having a window onto something they would rather you not see. This one doesn't do that as much, but we'll see in a moment. It does more of this pathos. But also, just notice this great musculature of this man. So he's very strong. He has the leather wrapped around his fists and his wrists. And so he's certainly a man who can inflict a lot of pain in the boxing arena. But his face looks at us as if he doesn't want that anymore. That this life is over for him, and this emotion is in real contrast to the what we saw in the 5th century with the severe style. We see great emotion here. There's a copy of this sculpture at Roger Williams Park. If you ever have a chance to go see it, it's really impressive sculpture. And speaking of this sort of pruriency, this peeking in on other people's lives, this is the very famous Barberini faun or sleeping faun, where obviously these sculptors have given up on any sort of idea of leaving things open to the imagination and just putting this nude straight out in our face. And here we see this faun, this mythical male that lives in the woods, very muscular. You can see the muscles in his chest and under his arms show that the artist really understands the human form. But then again, he spreads his legs in front of us, revealing everything, and it's as if we've caught him, passed out or something. And the fauns were known for drinking, and he is sleeping on a deer skin, and so he's a sort of there's a wildness to this sleeping man, but also, of course, great sensuality. And the artists of the Hellenistic period would not shy away from the sculptures. And as we'll see, these would have a great influence on the Romans. The Romans really admired the Hellenistic sculptures. And one here, we really get this idea of pruriency and of hypercharged sexuality. Another one on this same line is the Cupid or Eros and Psyche. Cupid on the left, the young girl on the right. Psyche means soul. We get this type of sculpture in the Hellenistic period. I don't have a specific date for you, but this sculpture has been copied throughout history, or at least the idea of Cupid and Psyche, or love and soul. And many modern artists have done variations on this. But here's what's a little bit strange about this sculpture. These two young people are kissing, obviously, and it's a nice and loving embrace. But you can also see by the lower halves of at least the Cupid's body that these are still very young people, prepubescent. Um, and this, of course, would be shocking to the modern world. In fact, so illegal. And the prepubescency of them is shown by the fact that his hips are still quite somewhat feminine, and not much different than her hips. And but nevertheless, they at this young age they are engaging in very adult activity. I can't tell you what was thought of this, if it was considered okay, or if this was meant to make a shocking statement. But I have sort of a feeling it might be the former. We have in our society, we have laws about this, about what at what age you can engage in sexual behavior, and underneath this, below a given age, it's illegal. Um, what's weird though is if you go to parts of the world that are very agriculturally based, put it that way. They're not urban dwellers. Marriages happen quite early in life. I know two women on the island of Crete where I work. Very good women. They've lived in sort of simple villages in the mountains of Crete. Both of which, however, got pregnant at the age of 14, and that was not. And they say that with pride, right? And they got married at that age. Um, I shouldn't say they say it with pride, but they say it with as if it's no big deal. Another friend of mine, her mother, we were talking. We were exactly the same age, and she said with pride that she had her first son when she was 15 years old. And in many of these societies, once you've gone through puberty, you're of marrying age. Okay, not in our society, but in this one. In any case, this gives us a really the idea of pruriency, of peeking in on other people's lives. We really see in this sculpture, and it really has an erotic side to it that's somewhat disturbing for the modern mind. Well, let's go back to Pathos. And I want to talk about the sculpture on the right. I show you the sculpture on the left. You don't have to know that bronze, but I just want to show to you once again how the muscles of the body are different now. Once again, far more like a weightlifter, than the swimmer's body. Now, the one on the right is called the Ludovisi Gaul killing himself and his wife. The Gauls were the people of Europe that the Greeks considered barbarians. Gauls specifically should refer to the French. Perhaps you know the adjective Gallic. It comes from this to mean French-like. To the Greeks, it was just everybody sort of up there, in Europe for them. But here's a really fascinating sculpture, in that it's a Gaul, a barbarian, who's about to be captured, and rather than being captured, him and his wife being captured, he kills her and is in the process of killing himself. Now we have to keep in mind that taking prisoner of war was a really, really bad thing. She would probably be, literally a sexual slave, and he would be a slave as well. He could be sent into mines, into the mines where the gold or silver mines, where he might last only a couple months. Just depending on who bought him. and his wife. And rather than suffer that humiliation, he kills her. And we can see that as he holds her left arm, her life is leaving her. She's collapsing as death overwhelms her. And then he turns back and puts his sword underneath the sternum at the base of his neck, so he can get underneath the rib cage and straight into the heart. And we see this wonderful verticality of the statue with the sword coming down into the body and then cutting across the head of the woman here. Uh, Suicide in the ancient world was considered honorable. Um, if the situation emerged where perhaps you've lost a battle, or perhaps you've been convicted of a terrible crime, and death was the punishment, it was considered honorable for you to do it yourself rather than to make somebody else do it. And this is interesting because what it's showing in the Hellenistic period, this period where Alexander had really expanded the world for them, and the Greeks learned a lot more about the world around them. It shows a bit of sympathy for these people, that he has some honor, that he wouldn't let his wife be taken into slavery. He would rather kill her and himself. And notice we have it at the exact moment that he's about to die. He's going to be dead in another 30 seconds. And so we have it right at that moment. Also notice the nice twisting of his body as he spins, turns his head to the back here, and lunges this sword into his chest. And so there's a lot of dynamism and strength to his body, just as his wife lacks any and is completely sort of slack and collapses in this terrible, terrible moment. Following along that theme, we have the dying trumpeter, Gallic trumpeter. You can see the trumpet at his feet laying on the ground. It's not like a modern trumpet. Trumpets were made out of elephant tusks, hollowed out elephant tusks, and that's what this is. He wears a torque around his neck. That's a metal chain that the Northerners, the barbarians of the North, wore. Notice the wonderful portrayal of his hair with the thick locks and looking very, very, very naturalistic, very real. And he has a mustache as well. And he has just suffered a wound, and he has dropped his horn, and he's collapsed, and he is about to die. Here it is from the backside. So we can see this sculpture is a sculpture in the, to be seen in the round. And notice just the fine details of the vertebrae and the rib bones on the torso and the back, or the bottom of the feet. It's just very, very well done. Very precise depiction of the body at this moment. Once again, where it is just about to lose its spirit. It's about to lose all of its life. And that's, again, an example of pathos, of looking at somebody and understanding their misery and empathizing with the fact that they are about to die. Now, another sculpture I want you to be familiar with is this Nike of Samothrace. This is probably the most famous example of a Nike. Once again, Nike represents victory. Victory is, a beautiful woman with wings. A beautiful woman because victory is an attractive and desirable thing. With wings because victory is fleeting. You have it and then it goes. And she's frequently shown alighting onto the prow of a ship. If any of you have been to the Louvre in Paris, you've seen this, and it's very prominently displayed on a stairwell. Really impressive. It's a very large statue. It's missing its head, obviously. But what's wonderful about this is that the drapery of the clothing cut across her legs and her torso and are tight on it, to give it the feel that she's moving forward, that she's been flying from behind, and she is just landing. And so the clothing gives it that motion. If the clothing were just straight down, she would just be looking like she's standing there. But here we can uh, see the moments before she landed because of this clothing. And once again, I just want to reinforce an idea that begins here with the Nike, but will continue on throughout history and art, of the idea of women representing abstract concepts. In this case, victory. But you're all familiar with the Statue of Liberty, where this female represents the abstract ideas of liberty. And perhaps you're familiar with the Delacroix painting of victory leading the people, and it's from the French Revolution, and it shows a beautiful topless woman leading the people of Paris in a revolution. In any case, we begin to get these ideas with the Nike of Samothrace, and this is an important statue for you to know, and we'll see it developed upon by the Romans. Now, one last famous statue before we get to the Greek theater is the Laocoon. It's a little bit late in the Hellenistic period, 20 BC, but it still has the Hellenistic style. It's probably past the dates I said for the end of the Hellenistic period, but just a little bit. Now, the story of Laocoon deals with the Trojan War. It's not discussed in the Iliad or the Odyssey, but it's known from the later writers who flesh out the Trojan War epics. And this is something that concerns this guy, a Trojan guy, who got in trouble with the Trojans after the Trojans had lost the war. It's a complex story, but let's put it this way. A serpent is said to take him and his two sons and drag them into the ocean. And they are just about to die once again. Look at his face on the upper right. Once again, this open mouth and the forehead with a lot of furrows in it, and the deep eyes and the deep locks of hair. But you can see the emotion as he struggles to release himself from this serpent that wraps around him and his sons. Once again, he has this extraordinarily muscular body with no fat on it. And like the Gaul committing suicide, his right arm turns back. But in this case, he's not holding a dagger, but he's grabbing back at a portion of that snake's body and trying to get it off him. His sons to his left and right are being dragged away as well. Now, it's interesting. I want to point out something about the younger people here, the two sons. And I forgot to mention this with the Hermes and Dionysus, is that the Greeks just tended to make children like just small adults. And they really don't have, the idea of showing a child correctly in many cases. The sculptor did with the Cupid and Psyche, but in this case, they just look like beardless grown-ups, basically, and just smaller. But they look like adults who are just too small. They don't have the childish features in them or adolescent features. But the snake wraps around all three of these characters and in fact keeps this statue together, keeps it whole. And the outside of the image on the lower left, is probably the size of the stone before it was unchiseled. And so probably about half the amount of stone is missing to make this wonderful sculpture. If you ever go to the Vatican, you can see it there. And if you've read Virgil's Aeneid, there's a wonderful description of it when Virgil describes Aeneas walking through Carthage and seeing various sculptures at Carthage. And he describes this so precisely that it is almost certain that Virgil saw this statue or a variation thereof. His description is so precise. So once again, we get this idea of pathos in Hellenistic artwork. Basically, the orchestra pit. The stage was at the bottom, and then there's the orchestra pit where the chorus and the plays could sing, and then the seats go up in this, half shell appearance to them. These theaters were built so the acoustics could work. So wherever you sit in the theater, you'll hear the people on the stage. Keep in mind they had no means by which to amplify their voices, at least not artificially. What they sort of did is they would put little megaphones though in their masks. And remember, the Greeks had these huge masks they'd wear on stage. And if it was a comedy, the mask would have a smile. If it was a tragedy, it would have a frown. And those are the symbols of the theater, as you all know. But in those masks, there would be a little megaphone at the mouth, and that would help project the voice. But for the most part, it was the actor's voice. So it was like an opera where they had to really, really, yell out their lines. But the structure was also built in a way that with harmonics in mind. Here we see another depiction of it, so to give you an idea of what the stage looked like. All the stages are now missing from these theaters. Um, but so you could come in from the bottom and walk up the stairways to your little wedge, or you could come in from the top. And here's another angle. This is the angle I wanted to show you. The trick you always get by the tour guides here is that they have you sit at the very top, and then they talk down in the orchestra pit in the bottom. And the simple fact is you can hear it. So these things are built to acquire acoustics. When Dr. Dragoulis and I, about 10 years ago now, took some students on a Maymester to Greece, and here we are on the lower right, all the students sitting there. One of the students is giving a presentation. But we're sitting at the top in the shade because it was very hot. And Dr. Dragula is down there in the center. He's just that little guy there at the bottom, standing right in front of the seats. And he is reciting for us in Greek the opening lines of the Iliad. And we can hear him perfectly. He has to speak loud, but he doesn't have to scream. And that's how well built these are. And they are so well built that we basically use the same idea to this very day, this idea of a theater. And this is one way in which the Greeks really spread their ideas, their way of thinking, in this idea of Hellenism, where their myths could be used to present tragedies that would really alter, the way you think about the world of these characters, these stock characters like Oedipus, a person in continuous denial of who he is. Well, we all know people like that. Or in Antigone, where she is a bit too stubborn on her religious beliefs, but Creon at the same time is too stubborn in his belief in the rule of law, and being so stubborn. They don't bend so they break, and their lives are ruined because of this. And we all know people like that can be a bit too stubborn. And so these plays, through their mythology, expose us to people that we know around us. And they are still taught to this very day. They're so impressive. Indeed, Shakespeare would read these plays. And, they've been read throughout history and have become fundamental to Western theater. So I want you to remember Epidaurus, because I'm going to come back to this when we talk about Roman theaters and the amphitheaters or colosseums.